Thank you for tuning in and welcome to our second seminar of 2023. We have 4 great speakers on our lineup today, so I think it'll be a great seminar. We have Dr. Heather Browning, Dr. Andrea Harvey, Dr. Daniel Hanley, and Dr. Bonnie Flint. So just as some quick introductions, Dr. Browning received her PhD in animal welfare from the Australian National University in 2020. She then held a 2-year postdoctoral research position at the London School of Economics, researching animal sentience and welfare, before becoming a lecturer in philosophy at the University of Southampton. She also has years of experience with zookeeping and zoo animal welfare. Dr. Andrea Harvey has been a veterinarian since 2000 and has been undertaking wild animal welfare research since 2015. She received her PhD in wild animal welfare in 2022 from the University of Technology, Sydney, where she is currently a research fellow in wild animal welfare at the Centre for Compassionate Conservation. Dr. Daniel Hanley received his PhD in biological sciences from the University of Windsor in 2011, and he currently holds a research faculty position in the Department of Biology at George Mason University. His lab studies visual perception and cognition in wild birds. And then we also have Dr. Flint, who completed her PhD at the Virginia Tech Department of Biological Sciences, where she focused on behavioral ecology in Botswana mongoose. So in addition to teaching and conservation experience, she's also an active member of the Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Committee for the Wild Animal Initiative team, and acts as a scientific consultant for the educational YouTube channel Crash Course. So together they will be giving a talk entitled Understanding Animals, Behavior and Welfare Entangled. So thank you to all our speakers, and I guess Heather, you'll be kicking it off for us.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Here. All right, so thanks everyone for coming along today. So I'm going to start off the session by talking a bit about animal behavior and welfare, giving a bit of the background to what we mean when we're talking about welfare and some of the links to behavior before the other speakers give some more specific examples of the way these things interact. So just to outline, I'll be talking a bit about what we mean when we're talking about welfare, some of the questions about assessing welfare in the wild and the types of measures that we might use, and also talking about some of the links between welfare and behavior. So the first question, what is welfare? There are many different definitions of welfare that people use when they're talking about animal welfare. The 3 primary ones that come up are usually physical functioning, which refers to the sort of health and fitness of the animal, natural living, which thinks about the natural evolved behaviors of the animal, and the affective state, which is how the animal feels. And what's really important to think about is that how we conceptualize welfare, which definition we use, is going to have impacts on how we do our research and how we make decisions about how to improve animal welfare as well. Because if we take welfare to be one state or a different state, it's going to mean that the types of measures that we use or the types of interventions that we recommend are going to vary. So one of the primary things to think about is that it's really important just to start out by being clear on what you mean when you're talking about welfare. And now thinking about these different concepts, welfare as physical functioning, like I said, is thinking about the bodily health and fitness of an animal. One of the reasons I don't think this is one of the better concepts to be using is that it leaves out a lot of things that we might think matter to welfare, particularly some of the psychological states. So an animal might have, say, good bodily health and fitness, but if it's feeling a lot of fear or anxiety, then its welfare might still be poor. So we might think that physical functioning is more of an instrumental part of welfare, where poor functioning influences the welfare of an animal. So it might cause pain or nausea or restrict its behaviors to things that it would want to do, it's no longer able to do. And so it has this instrumental impact, but physical functioning itself may not be thought of as, the intrinsic definition of welfare. Next, we can think about natural living. And here, welfare would be taken to be living according to the evolved natural history of the animal. Now, one of the big problems with this definition is it really can't account for describing poor welfare in wild animals. These wild animals are living perfectly naturally. They're living exactly as they've evolved to do in most cases. But we still probably want to say that there are things that happen in their lives which are bad for their welfare. Their animals in the wild can die of dehydration. They can experience, fires. They can experience aggression or predation. All these things that we think probably decrease their welfare, but are perfectly natural. So again, we think, well, maybe this is another instrumental effect on welfare, that we can think many natural behaviors feel good and they're good for welfare because there are evolved psychological reward systems that make these behaviors feel good for the animals. But it's not the case that the naturalness itself is what is constituting welfare. And then finally, if we think about this affective state view of welfare, here we're thinking about the balance of the positively and negatively valent subjective mental states that the animal experiences, roughly its pleasures and pains. So where good welfare would be having mostly positive mental states, and poor welfare would be having mostly negative ones. And when we're thinking, I said, roughly pleasures and pains, but obviously it extends much further than this. So there's this range of different sort of felt experiences an animal can have that can contribute to its welfare in this sense. Hunger, sickness, thermal comfort, boredom, loneliness, curiosity, fear, resting comfort, all of these things together would then constitute welfare. And then we can think about how they come together to give an animal's experience, both at a time, all the things it's feeling right now, and also over its lifetime. So the balance of all the different things it feels at different moments in time. But what's important here is really thinking about what is the affect, what is the feeling that animal is having, and that's what's impacting its welfare. Question then comes up, can we measure affective state? There is this worry that the mental states of animals are sort of hidden, they're too private to ever get a good scientific grip on. But I think there are good evolutionary reasons to think that animals' mental states cause changes in their behavior and physiology that represent those mental states. And those changes can then be things that we measure. If there weren't these sorts of changes, if the physiology and behavior of an animal didn't change in response to its mental states, it wouldn't then be available for selection to act upon. So if we think that animals have evolved to have these feelings, it's going to be causing some changes that then we're then able to go and measure. And finally, when we think about welfare in this way, there's a very close link to sentience. So here by sentience, what I mean is an animal having the capacity to have these felt experiences that we're talking about, these pleasures, these pains, all these different feelings. And when an animal is sentient and it does have these feelings, we would then say that this animal is a welfare subject. And so then we have these links between sentience research, which is trying to figure out what sentience is like, and particularly which animals are sentient. And this links back to welfare science. So recent work suggesting that octopuses are almost certainly sentient then gives us reason to be concerned about their welfare and to think that welfare science should be looking at those animals. So when we're thinking about animals in the wild, perhaps we're thinking about what kinds of animals are going to be sentient, which ones are going to be welfare subjects, and depending on what those answers are, will change what it is that we think we need to be doing. So the second question is then how we assess welfare in the wild. So there are many methods that are currently used for assessing welfare in captive animals, and many of these can then also be used in the wild to think about behavior and the welfare of wild animals. And here I'm going to talk about two different types of methods. So there are welfare indicators, which are sort of single measures, and welfare metrics, which combine a lot of different information into talking about welfare. So welfare indicators, these are a single measure that's taken to reflect welfare either in part or in whole. So we have whole animal measures where this single measure is taken to represent the entire welfare state of the animal. So that's all its sort of integrated positive and negative feelings. I'm not going to go into any detail on these, but some possible measures include cognitive judgment bias, qualitative behavioral assessment, maybe some measures of biological aging, like changes in telomere length. The important thing is that the output of these are telling us something about the overall state of welfare of the animal. In contrast these to partial indicators, which just represent some smaller aspect of welfare. So they might be animal-based ones. So these are the behaviors and physiology of the animal, and these usually represent some specific feeling or affect that the animal's having. So we might think, stereotypic behaviors might be representative of, say, a feeling of boredom, or changes in blood cortisol levels representative of stress. And then there are also environmental or resource indicators that tell us about the conditions that impact welfare. So the presence of shelters or the amount of food availability. But importantly, all of these just tell us about one aspect of welfare and not the total welfare. So when we've got all these different partial indicators that are telling us about the different components, we can then combine these into welfare metrics that try to use all these different aspects of welfare and bring that information together to tell us something about what welfare is like overall. And one of the models of these is the 5 domains model, which we'll be hearing about shortly from Andrea, which is looking at all these different domains that we can think about impacting on welfare, the nutrition, the environment, the health, and the behavior of the animal, and then thinking about how this all impacts the mental domain, which is these feelings or affective states that I was talking about. Now, if we're evaluating these different methods, the benefits of using the whole animal measures is that they are comprehensive. They tell us about the entire welfare state of the animal, but they have a drawback in that they don't tell us anything about what we should improve. If we know the animal's welfare is good or poor, we don't have any idea about what it is in the life of that animal that's causing these changes. So welfare metrics, on the other hand, have the benefit of having this comprehensive overview of telling us about all the different aspects of welfare. They're telling us about which changes in the environment or which parts of the animal are doing well or poorly. But the drawbacks are that these can be potentially incomplete. They might not include everything that matters for welfare. And it can also be hard to determine how to weight the different aspects. So we think, does an animal that has poor nutrition, is it better or worse off in terms of its welfare than an animal that has poor health? Very difficult to tell, and sometimes figuring out these weightings can be quite subjective. So for that reason, I think often using both of these things together can be a really good way of getting the most information you can about an animal to also, have the benefits and offset the shortcomings of each of the measures. But importantly, the sort of upshot, I guess, of what I'm talking about here is that when you're thinking about how to assess welfare of an animal, you want to select a method that relates best to the goal or the context of the measurement. So whether that's doing an overall welfare assessment, wanting to answer the question, is this animal doing well or badly? Maybe you want to identify areas to change, or maybe you want to look at the impact of a specific condition. How does welfare change when we change the type of food that this animal gets? And which measure is going to be the best ones is going to depend on which of these contexts you're in. And the wild animal context add these sort of additional challenges to do with feasibility. So we've got these measures that are often used in captivity, but when you're in the wild, you've got problems that you can't access the same equipment in the field. You may not have ongoing or repeated access to the animals. It's not always easy to get to the animals to do measures over time. And you also don't have the ability to do prior training of the animals that's required for some of the methods. So selecting the best methods for use in the wild is going to require a little bit of extra sort of assessment of which of these is going to do better. But one of the things we see is that while wild animals have the same capacity for good or poor welfare as captive animals, they're still sentient animals, they still have experiences. Measurement of welfare in the wild is still pretty rare. There's not many people who are actively going out and spending their time trying to get information about the welfare of wild animals. And where they do so, often they're just using measures of stress or body condition as sort of an indicator of welfare, but these aren't necessarily directly tied to the overall affective state. So it's often getting quite limited information. So one of the things we're thinking about here is, what kind of measures can you use to get a better overall look at welfare? And so to finish up, we'll talk about the links between welfare and behavior. And in particular, this kind of introduces what will be coming in some of the talks you'll see after mine. So there are different ways that there are connections between welfare and behavior. One of them is that behavior can be used as a measure of welfare. That's one of the things I was just talking about. But also, sort of flipping that around, welfare can be used as an explanatory variable to explain why we see certain patterns or changes in behavior. And then finally, there's also understanding the behavior of animals can help you assess the possible welfare effects of different interventions and how well or poorly you're likely to go. If you do some sort of intervention, is it actually going to change the animals' lives? That's going to depend on their kinds of behavior. And the talks that we see after mine will sort of cover each of these three different connections. So thinking about behavior as a welfare indicator, there's lots of different ways that behaviors can be used to assess welfare. Abnormal behaviors such as stereotypies can indicate poor welfare experience. There might be behaviors that are associated with specific affects like play or aggression or inactivity. But what's really important is that when using some sort of behavioral indicator to assess welfare, that this behavior is actually a valid indicator of welfare. So it's not enough to just say this animal's behavior changed in some way, therefore its welfare changed. You need to think more directly and hopefully go through a validation process of looking at, does this behavior actually represent a change in welfare for the animal? Some changes might be welfare neutral, other ones might be positive, other ones might be negative. And then related to this, welfare influences behavior. So many behaviors do change in relation to an animal's welfare state. That's exactly why we can use them to indicate welfare. One example of this is cognitive judgment bias, which measures the optimism or pessimism of an animal. An animal becomes more optimistic as its welfare improves and more pessimistic as its welfare decreases. And so if you didn't understand this, you might look at the way animals interpret ambiguous stimuli and not understand that this is representing their welfare. So when you understand how welfare influences behavior, this can help in identifying alternative explanations for observed behavioral patterns. You see certain patterns of behavior in groups of animals. The differences between them might not just be in their environments or their genetics or something like that. It may also be in their welfare. And failing to account for this when studying behavior can then lead to unreliable and unreproducible results. So in conclusion, animal welfare, as we're discussing it here, relates to the affective state of the animal. So it's sort of, mental states, it's feelings. And there are many different ways that we can assess welfare, but particularly pay attention to the fact that the method that you choose should relate to the context and the question that you're trying to answer. And finally, there are many close connections between an animal's welfare and its behavior. So behavior can be used to measure welfare. Welfare can be an explanatory variable for behavior. And also understanding behavior can help you assess possible welfare effects of interventions. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be talking now more specifically about how animal behavior can help us to understand their welfare. And I'm talking about aspects of my PhD, which was on wild horse welfare, and how we assess their welfare and what associations there were between population and behavioral ecology. So some key behaviors that came out of this work were the way that horses would use the habitat, the areas that they would roam in terms of distances or home ranges, their time budget behaviors, but also qualitative behaviors, their social organization, so the number of close companions that they had, the social stability of those herds as well, affiliative behaviors that they might display, other behaviors such as play or resting, also variations in their gait, whether they were just walking most of the time or whether they did have more periods of trot, canter, gallop, and also sickness behaviors. So things like lameness, other alterations in their gait, like weakness or changes in their body posture, and also changes in facial expressions. So quite a wide range of behaviors that were possible to assess. I used the 5 domains model for assessing welfare in these wild horses. Heather's obviously already mentioned the 5 domains model. So just to go into that in a little bit more detail. So the 5 domains model structurally represents this idea that physical and functional states are linked to mental experiences. And because mental experiences or affective states are subjective, they can't be measured directly. But what we know is that there are links between physical states and mental states, and we can measure indicators of welfare in each of these 4 physical or functional domains, and then using the scientific knowledge that we have across behavioral sciences, neuroscience, neuroethology, and so on, we can cautiously infer what mental experiences the animal may be having. And Heather's already mentioned the sort of range of different negative and positive mental experiences that we might be thinking of in these animals. So the first stage in my PhD was developing a conceptual framework for how we actually go about doing that in wild animals. There's obviously lots of challenges in wild animals compared to domestic or captive animals. So I developed this 10-stage protocol. I'll put up a number of publications from my PhD so people can look those up if you want to have more information from those. So this sort of details the 10-stage protocol of how to apply the 5 domains model to wild free-roaming animals, using horses as an example. A initial part of that protocol is developing really detailed foundational knowledge of the species that you're studying, and particularly from a behavioral point of view, knowledge of what's usual for the species that you're studying under optimal conditions is really important. And this is a good example of how behavior and welfare really go hand in hand, because unless we're assessing welfare alongside behavior, we don't know what's usual for that animal under optimal conditions, and that can really lead to misinterpretation of data. So for example, the horses you see in the image here are living in a desert environment. They've been documented to walk really, really long distances because food sources and water sources are really far apart. So it could be considered that it's usual for these horses to be walking really vast distances, but they're probably not under optimal conditions. And so that's really important that we know what's usual for the animal when they're in optimal conditions, so when their welfare is good. Another part of the protocol is developing methodology for how we're going to evaluate particularly animal-based welfare indicators. Again, it's a lot more challenging than in domestic or captive animals, so more novel methodologies are used. In horses, certainly direct observations can be used, but that's going to limit the horses that we can actually assess. So a lot of the work that I did used remote camera traps that are able to take both still images and video recordings as well. So I was able to actually measure a really wide range of animal-based welfare indicators that included a lot of behavioral data as well. So this just gives some examples of the type of images that we could capture. The ones of the groups of horses up here and down at the bottom here are actually photographs taken by direct observation of horses. And then the rest of these are from camera trap images. So you can see that the different methodologies really complement each other in the type of information that you may get. But certainly the camera traps are hugely valuable in getting quite close up behavioral data from horses that you may never actually directly be able to see. And these are some more examples of camera trap images showing the range of the type of behaviors that we can pick up. So you can see here, we've got a foal nursing from its mum. Here we've got foals playing. This is a really good example, I think, of a horse showing vitality, of fitness. Whereas the example here of a very thin horse that's actually roaming quite long distances in search for food and is often on its own. So the next part of the protocol that we have to do, bearing in mind, as Heather's so eloquently explained, that when we're talking about welfare state, what we're really talking about in contemporary animal welfare science is the mental experiences or the affective state that the animal is experiencing. And because we can't measure that directly, we're measuring indicators of physical or functional states. And then we need to be able to scientifically validate the link between those measurable indicators and the mental experiences that we're proposing that they reflect. And so this is what I've done in a more recent publication looking at mental experiences in wild animals and the process of scientifically validating those measurable welfare indicators. So just to go through some more examples, firstly, looking at measurable behavioral indicators of negative mental experiences. So the image here shows two horses. They're bachelor stallions that were grazing. They've been subjected to human disturbance, and they've very rapidly gone from grazing to galloping in the opposite direction. You can also see there's quite a lot of tension through their neck. Their head and neck are held high. There's also sort of tension in their facial muscles. So this combination of behaviorals and postural changes indicate anxiety or fear in the horse. This image down here is a horse that suffered a really severe lower limb injury. So the horse was very lame, which is an indicator of limb pain, which also leads to other negative experiences, because as the horse is unable to move around, it's harder to keep up with the rest of its herd. It makes it more challenging for the horse to forage and eat and to access water and so on. And so that quickly leads to other mental experiences as well, other negative mental experiences. Some more examples of negative mental experiences. These obviously are all horses that are in very poor body condition and were having secondary impacts from this. The horse here had initially been in a large herd with access to lots of grazing land. But as we went through a drought, there was very little feed available, and the herd dispersed, and this horse was seen wandering alone over large distances in search of food. The body posture that you can see here, the head held lower than the withers and the ears back, all indicators of chronic pain or malaise, fatigue, or even exhaustion as well. And some of these horses were captured on video, showing that they were actually quite weak in their gait as well. This is a horse that I was directly observing and had been observing for a long period of time from when she was in good body condition as well. And it was really evident that her vigilance or her level of alertness really rapidly reduced as she became so emaciated. She was so focused just on eating, you could approach her quite closely and she would barely lift her head. And the horse here, again, similar to the one on the left, but you can perhaps see a bit more clearly the facial expression and again, the ears back, all signs of chronic pain, which can be associated with fatigue and exhaustion in horses as well. And then here's some measurable behavioral indicators of positive mental experiences. So positive mental experiences may happen when a horse is behaving in a way to avoid a negative mental experience. So these horses have been grazing, and so that's overcoming any hunger. But as a result of that grazing activity, they now have postprandial satiety, and it's known in horses that they'll often have this standing resting period when they're satiated after eating. So they're very relaxed horses, having this exhibiting this standing resting. Similarly, the horses here have sought shade under the tree to overcome any heat discomfort, but they're also going to be experiencing some pleasures with standing resting there in the shade. And similarly with the image below of horses immersing themselves in water, they may be doing this to overcome heat discomfort, but they may then be experiencing pleasures of being in that cool water. And a few other images here. This is a young bachelor stallion that was very curious, again, sort of exhibiting that vitality of fitness. Horses below here exhibiting very close affiliative social interactions and mutual grooming, and a range of behaviors that you can see in the image here, from grazing to standing resting to lying resting to maternal nurturing and allo grooming as well. So all behavioral indicators of positive mental experiences. So the take-home message really from what I've talked about is that careful assessment of a really wide range of behaviors can really provide very insightful information about both the presence and the nature of both negative and positive mental experiences in wild animals. Thank you.
Thank you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about the way in which perception can be used to better improve welfare for wild animals. As we continue to expand urban centers, our interaction with wildlife is increasingly common. There are instances where these interactions can actually benefit animals and be positive, but very many of these interactions actually can negatively impact the welfare of wild populations. And a prime example for the work that we do is our fatal avian window strikes. So more than 600 million birds every year are lost to flying into window surfaces. And this obviously has a direct impact on the welfare of those individuals, but the unseen and unmeasured non-fatal strikes are also impacted, and individuals who lose family members, like parents, are subjected to negative welfare impacts as well. And one of the reasons that this happens is that birds are perceiving windows as surfaces or passages with which they can fly through, and the reason this happens is because birds rely heavily on their ability to their visual abilities for making decisions on the fly. Birds rely very heavily on color information. So many of the important aspects of their lives are dictated by the colors that they perceive. This helps set their daily and seasonal circadian rhythms. It helps birds find adequate food, so it helps them with foraging and finding adequate mates. And the visual contrast actually helps birds navigate as well. So the visual contrast among leaves actually allows birds to fly through dense foliage. So they really do rely on visual information and can get tricked when they're seeing reflective surfaces. This really dynamic image of a kingfisher illustrates a really prime example of a bird that can deal with complex visual information, both viewing prey items from above, discounting highly reflective surfaces of the water, diving through that water, capturing that prey and moving through the environment. So they have the ability to process visual information and compensate for these reflective surfaces. And nobody would sort of argue that this horizontally oriented reflective surface could confuse birds. Birds are not flying into these surfaces because they've long adapted to deal with reflections on a horizontal plane. But many times our structures that we're erecting are vertical in nature and are relying heavily on reflective surfaces. So it's becoming increasingly common that buildings are using more and more glass. And so the entire sides of buildings can be covered in glass that are reflective. And birds have not adapted a mechanism to deal with reflections on this vertical orientation. The simple shifting of a horizontal plane or reflective plane to a vertical reflecting plane can affect the polarization of that light, which can actually draw birds in. And the fact that birds are not expecting to see reflective properties in this context will lead to confusion, which allows birds to think that this is something that they can fly through. And this has long been recognized, and we've been using various kinds of solutions various kinds of solutions to address this. And one of those solutions are applying window decals on the outer surfaces of those glass. The purpose here is to obstruct the background so that birds can actually recognize these as solid surfaces and things that they cannot fly through. And we've often relied on ultraviolet reflective or ultraviolet absorbing decals because we can't see them, so the window would still be effective so that you could see through these decals, but birds would actually be able to see them and know that this is solid and it's something that they can avoid. So this is just an example of some decals that we were applying to windows, where this here is one that's been removed and this is an actual decal. And I'll switch this to an ultraviolet image so you can see that this area here is absorbing quite a bit of ultraviolet light. It might be very dark for you. This one's been removed. And we'll take a look at this a little bit later in the talk. But it's very important to consider how birds are actually perceiving this and the fact that they can be tricked by these optical effects, because birds are lost, many birds are lost every year. And these are just a few of the images of birds that we saw on our campus this last fall that were the product of these fatal window strikes. And if you were to scale this up beyond our campus to the entire nation or the entire world, you'll see that this is a really detrimental impact on these natural populations and the knock-on effects to their families and young birds that are relying on these birds for sustenance and for their effective states. So at George Mason University, we've been working with more than 40 undergraduate and students and community volunteers to log more than 3,000 different building surveys to detect ultimately 86 fatal window strikes at just 33 buildings on our campus. This would highlight the impact that this has on the local scale, and which would only expand when we look at it larger scales. You look at an image of Quentin Jameson, who's leading a discussion about avian perception and window strikes. And despite our long understanding of the role of vision for leading to these types of events, very few studies have actually considered how color perception interfaces with these events, nor the resolution of birds' vision or how these surfaces appear to birds at speed and at distances that are relevant. So the first thing we really need to do is think about the way in which birds see, which is naturally different than how we see ourselves. Unlike us, birds are tetrachromatic, meaning that they have 4 different photoreceptors. And one of those photoreceptors is sensitive to ultraviolet light or violet light that we are insensitive to, so we don't see this. But they do perceive blue, green, and red light, much like ourselves. And you're looking at a characterization of the photoreceptor sensitivities of these 4 photoreceptors. And for any surface, and this is one of the things that we do when we measure glass, we have to consider the 3 different important aspects. We have to consider the color of the light that's available to reflect from that surface. And in terms of glass, we're looking at this at various angles relative to the sun and the approaching bird. The reflective properties of the object itself, as well as the sensitivity of each of those photoreceptors. And when we do so, we can get a really accurate metric of how much light would be capturable by each one of those photoreceptors that we can use in downstream models to test how obvious those decals might be to a bird in motion, but also how obviously different those reflective images are from real life images. But of course, these are only the physiological aspects of color vision, and color vision is much more than the sum of the parts of these physiological aspects. It's an entire psychological experience. And so the colors that you would perceive are impacted both by both by context, so the neighboring colors, the light, your culture, and even your language can impact the kinds of colors that you would perceive. And I'm illustrating this by showing you a rainbow. And many of the people that are in the audience are going to be looking at this and perceiving several distinct color bands. But we know as scientists that this doesn't exist. The rainbow is actually constituting a continuous variation of color across the electromagnetic spectrum. And we're just perceiving these as color bands due to a higher order process known as color categorization. And birds will experience color categorization too. The reason I highlight this is that context is important, and that when you're looking at an entire pane of glass, a bird might perceive these as something that they could fly through because of the context. And so even if they can perceive that the colors are wrong, or there's a tinted glass, or that doesn't look right to them, when relative to all of the other colors, this will fool birds because their brain will process that visual information much the way your brain is processing this visual information that's in front of you. Luckily, there are lots of new technologies that are allowing us to better assess the efficiency and the accuracy of various solutions like these decals, or other types of solutions that we can use to mitigate these risks. We are advocating for the greater use of multispectral photography for these kinds of approaches. This will help us assess the visibility of those solutions on a glass surface, as well as the efficacy of the long-term sustainability of these as they degrade over time. You're looking at an image of a Maya Kano, who's a National Geographic field assistant who just applied a reflective decal onto this surface of glass. It's the one you were looking at earlier. And I'm going to change this from a human image just to an ultraviolet image. And what you're going to see is that it's relatively dark. That UV decal is dark, but the glass is dark as well because there's no ultraviolet light inside the room. Glass itself absorbs ultraviolet light much the way that decal does. So instead of increasing the contrast, it just appears relatively dark. This illustrates the point that we really need to be using these technologies to figure out exactly where and from which vantage points and approach angles these solutions would be effective. And now that we have these portable technologies, we can actually come up with better solutions and better utilization of these solutions. Researchers are also using field portable polarization cameras, and birds are drawn to polarized light. As light strikes a various surface, either horizontal or vertical, it will polarize. And the ability to have field portable polarizing cameras will help us assess where areas on buildings are greatest risk, and therefore distribute solutions to most effectively mitigate risk and improve welfare outcomes for these wild populations. So in summary, we're advocating for the greater application of studying of the optical properties of glass, both the inner and outer surfaces, and applying visual models that allow us to understand how those surfaces appear to the birds, and incorporating also information about the visual resolution of birds. Many birds would be considered legally blind by our standards because their visual acuity is much lower. So using that information, we can come up with the spacing that's required for birds to actually detect these patterns. And in so doing, we should be able to design a set of best practices that would mitigate and improve animal welfare for these birds. I just want to thank you guys for your attention, and the Wild Animal Initiative for incorporating scientists of all different walks of life to think about animal welfare, and particularly in wild populations, as well as our sources of funding. Thanks.
All right, thank you so much, Daniel. Let me share my screen. Okay, so thanks to all the previous speakers. I'm Bonnie Flint. I'm a researcher at Wild Animal Initiative. And we are very specifically trying to build the field of wild animal welfare science. You have heard some really great examples. Now you know what wild animal welfare is. You've seen some great examples of how it can be combined with behavioral research. And now we're hoping that you are interested in possibly adding it to your own behavioral research. So I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to how you can do that. And I will also give you some extra resources so that you can learn a little bit more about how to do it. So we can integrate wild animal welfare into behavioral field research, but there's a couple of different goals that you might want to meet here. So there's basically more or less two options, maybe three. I'm going to focus on these two. So maybe you just want to keep doing your normal behavioral research. You don't want to make welfare a focus, but you do want to control for variable welfare within your subjects. So that's the first thing I'm going to talk about. On the other hand, maybe you decided, hey, this welfare stuff is really cool, and you want to incorporate it as one of the other focuses of your research, in addition to the behavior that you're working on now. And I'm going to talk about that second. So controlling for welfare if you're doing behavioral research. So you might be looking sort of at a population level study. And maybe you're not collecting a lot of data at the individual level. So this is going to make it difficult to collect welfare measures on individuals. Welfare is an individual level variable. So what are you going to do about that if you want to control for welfare? So let's just give an example. Maybe you're studying immigration between different populations. So if you just want to get a welfare, an average for what the welfare might look like within your populations, you can look at upstream factors that will affect welfare within those populations. So some examples of that are resource availability, maybe the level of human disturbance, different environmental variables like temperature. We know that oftentimes temperature extremes can affect welfare. Predator or prey abundance, and so on. So while you won't be able to say what the welfare is of individuals within those populations, you can sort of get an idea of the welfare potential of your different populations. So you can expect that if one population is, let's say, in a drought, you know that their welfare is probably going to be lower than the welfare of some other population. And you can expect that their immigration behavior will likely be different because of that lowered welfare. On the other hand, if you are already doing behavioral research at the individual level, there are some ways to control for individual differences in welfare. And luckily, the way to do this is very similar to how you would control for things like personality or age or sex. So some of you may have heard before of the acronym used in psychology of WEIRD, which describes the peculiarity of Western populations that are sort of overrepresented in psychological studies. There is a method called the Strange method, which apparently there was a Animal Behavior Live seminar about that recently. And this is basically, I'm not going to read all of these out loud to you, but this is basically thinking about the background of the individuals within your study. And the E in Strange stands for experience. Now they meant this as sort of the previous experience of the individual to research. So have they been in an experiment before that would change their behavior? But I'm going to sort of co-opt it and say that it relates to the subjective experience of the animal as well. So if you are sort of making sure that all of these things have at least been thought about in your behavioral studies, then you can control for welfare in basically a very similar way as the Strange method. So I hope that you will read up on that. Now, let's say you just feel like you don't have time, you don't have the resources, you don't have the capabilities for going that in depth in controlling for welfare at the individual level. A very quick and dirty method, and Heather kind of mentioned this, it doesn't control for every aspect of welfare, but if you can look at condition indicators, things such as mass change or percentage of body fat, or maybe severe disease or injury states, at the very least, you can sort of catch the animals that have the poorest welfare, and you expect them to behave very differently from animals with more average welfare. Again, it's not perfect, but it does at least sort of get at the animals that are going to be acting very differently because of their welfare state. So that's kind of an overview of how you can control for welfare in whatever behavioral research you're working on. Now I'm going to talk briefly about if you actually want to start researching wild animal welfare within your greater behavioral program. There are many, many, many unanswered questions about wild animal welfare. Actually, most of the questions are unanswered. So I'm just going to give you a really short list to help you start thinking about what kinds of research avenues wild animal welfare fits into. On the next slide, I'm going to give you some resources for finding out more. But an example of this is if you're doing a behavioral study where you're looking at the effects of human disturbance on animal behavior, you can add in welfare there and see how it might be affecting their welfare in addition to their behavior. And that welfare might be actually a mediating factor that changes their behavior. Studies that explore interspecific interactions can look at how the different types or frequencies of interactions are affecting the welfare of both species. If they interact more, do they have better or worse welfare on those individuals? Time budgets are another type of behavioral study that can be used to look at welfare as well. So if you look at if you assess the welfare of individuals, you can see how that difference in welfare is affecting their time budget. So for example, animals that are in really great welfare condition are going to be trying to maintain that, whereas animals that are in poor welfare condition are going to be trying to change their welfare condition. So they're going to spend their time very, very differently. And then my final example here is if you're looking at personality, you can look at how does personality affect welfare and vice versa. This one is, I think, pretty easy to relate to. If a few of you, like me, are on the anxious side, you know that has an impact on your own welfare and how you feel at any specific time. So those are all really good ways, things that really haven't been looked at to any great degree that allow behavior and wild animal welfare to sort of be researched at the same time. So now I've just thrown a bunch of words up on the screen. I hope that you might take a picture of this. These are just some different resources that you can use. And I'm not just trying to plug all the people that have spoken today. These really are some of the very best resources to kind of get you started in looking at wild animal welfare. This first one is from us at Wild Animal Initiative. I really hope you'll take a look at that. The research priorities are not actually our own research priorities. They're the priorities that we hope everybody else will start researching. Right now we have an older version of it up, but in about probably 2 weeks, we're hoping to have an even more updated version of this. So please go take a look at our research priorities on our website. Over here, I have a few examples of welfare assessments that are behaviorally based for the most part. Maybe you're looking at this and you're like, oh, I already do biologging, or I already look at data for behavioral diversity, or whatever the case is. So you might want to read up on how those things impact welfare and how you could use them to assess welfare. So my last main slide is my citation slide, but mostly I just put this up so that you had to look at banded mongooses, which are my favorite animals and the ones that I did my PhD research on. And I just want to thank all of you for listening, and thank you to my fellow speakers and my colleagues at Wild Animal Initiative. And you can see all of our social media links and things. And please do feel free to email me if you're interested in learning more. One thing that I forgot to mention on our resources slide, Wild Animal Initiative also provides grants for research on wild animal welfare. And if you want to link it to your current research, that's what we really love to see. So if you're interested in this, please visit our website and have a look at our grant calls right now. Okay, that is all I have. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Bonnie, and thank you to all the speakers. So to anyone watching on YouTube, feel free to send in your questions. We do have one question in the chat from Mary Austin, just asking if you could share the resources slide again. So maybe we can leave that up during the question period unless we have to go back to any specific slides. But yeah, so feel free to ask your questions in the chat. But while we are just waiting for questions, I actually did have a bit of an interesting question just sort of during the whole talk, and a lot of the people in the ABL research team are insect researchers. And so just wanted to get sort of a feel from the speakers. Has any research been done on insect sentience or insect welfare, anything like that?
Yeah, I can answer a bit about insect sentience. And so projects that I've been involved with, the Foundations of Animal Sentience, one of the things that they were interested in doing was looking at how to come up with criteria for assessing sentience. And more recently, they've applied that framework to assessing whether insects are sentient, more specifically whether insects are capable of feeling pain, and essentially found that there's not a lot of research. So many of the criteria are just undefined because we don't know the answers. But where there was research, it was very largely on the positive side. And so I think now a lot of people in this area are starting to think that the balance of evidence is probably suggestive that insects are sentient and they do have that capacity for feeling pain and having a welfare state. But I think research into their welfare is very, very new, and there's hardly any of it.
Mm-hmm. And which insects was the research conducted on?
It was done across a range of different groups. So I don't remember, I can't off the top of my head say all the different sort of taxa that they had, but there were essentially a lot of the good evidence came out of fruit flies and bees, I think, were the two groups that had the most evidence for them. But they were essentially looking at sort of a range of different taxa of insects and looking at different life stages as well, if there was evidence for the adult and some of the larval or juvenile stages. And again, more of the evidence was there for the adults, very, very little in the juvenile stages.
So interesting. A model you never think would have sentience, but it's such an interesting area of research. Bonnie, did you have anything to add as well?
Yeah, I was gonna agree with Heather. There's been quite a bit of research, I feel like, on bees that has indicated that it's likely that they are sentient. There's actually a couple of books out. I think there's one called The Mind of Bees that might be an interesting read for some people. And I did want to mention the work hasn't been published yet, but there is a grantee from Wild Animal Initiative that is working on crickets, I believe, wild crickets. I can't give a lot of information about that, but yeah, so Wild Animal Initiative's view is basically like, if we don't have evidence that they're not sentient, we're willing to take a look at that. And we don't do sentience research itself, we sort of rely on sentience research. But we're sort of the mindset right now that, like, if there's not a reason to believe that they're not sentient animals, then we'll go ahead and think about their welfare, at least as it's important to us because they're so abundant, right? Like, there's so many insects. It's a group that you could really learn a lot about welfare with. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you for the feedback. And we do have just a comment in the chat from Lee Fluffsai. Thank you to everyone who spoke. As a dog behavior consultant, this doesn't apply directly, but it's still fascinating, and lots of things can still apply indirectly. So yeah, I guess this can apply to research as well as outside research, anywhere we use animals, really. So it doesn't look like there's any more questions or comments or anything on the YouTube chat. So we are coming up on our hour. So I guess we can wrap it up now if there are no more questions. So I want to say again, thank you to our speakers. I think this is the largest group seminar that we had. So it's great. We got 4 speakers. So thank you, Bonnie, Heather, Daniel, and Andrea for great talks. So just to the rest of the viewers, we do have a few other seminars, roundtables, and some information about our conference coming up. So just a note, our next seminar will be June 27th, and we're still in the process of planning our next roundtable. And then keep an eye out on our social media as well as our newsletter for more information on the roundtables, seminars, and conferences. So thank you again to our speakers, and we will see you in the next seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.